Bom, vamos dar continuidade ao simpósio, mas antes de dar continuidade, eu tenho no expediente algumas coisinhas rápidas para informar. O acadêmico José Carlos daqui a pouco vai fazer uma breve comunicação. E eu recebi uma carta do nosso acadêmico, professor Adolfo Rhodes, excelentíssimo senhor presidente da Academia Nacional de Medicina, professor Jorge Alberto Costa Silva, solicito a Vossa Excelência minha passagem a emérito. Respeitosamente, Adolfo Rhodes. Então, o professor Adolfo Rhodes, que está ali, lhe felicito agora como emérito, porque emérito é mais importante que titular. E considero, então, aberta esta vaga devido à emerência do professor e acadêmico Adolfo Rhodes. A partir de hoje, 90 dias. Bom, no expediente está em discussão e aprovação as atas de 12 e 19 de setembro que os acadêmicos receberam. Gostaria de saber se alguém tem algum comentário a fazer. Então, estão aprovadas as duas atas, 12 e 19 de setembro. A seguir, eu vou passar a palavra ao secretário-geral para saber se tem alguma comunicação aos acadêmicos.
Excelentíssimo senhor presidente da Academia Nacional de Medicina, acadêmico Jorge Alberto Costa Silva, nosso secretário Ricardo Cruz, excelentíssimo senhor e senhoras, meus prezados. Apenas uma comunicação a propósito da canonização da irmã Dulce Lopes Pontes, prima do professor Lopes Pontes, a primeira santa brasileira e, obviamente, tia do nosso acadêmico Eduardo Lopes Pontes. Ela foi canonizada em Roma no final de semana e é mais uma santa católica, né, do nosso país. Essa é a única comunicação da secretaria.
Muito obrigado. O acadêmico Ricardo Cruz, primeiro secretário, tem alguma comunicação?
Excelentíssimo presidente, Jorge Alberto Costa Silva, senhores acadêmicos, ilustres convidados, lembrando que no dia 14 de novembro não haverá sessão ordinária na Academia Nacional de Medicina, que no dia 28 de novembro haverá a eleição da nova diretoria para o biênio 2020-2021, que no dia 29 de novembro acontece, então, o jantar de confraternização de final de ano para os acadêmicos, e que no dia 6 de dezembro acontece em Portugal o encontro entre as Academias Nacional de Medicina do Brasil e de Portugal, dia 6 de dezembro, com 21 acadêmicos presentes, já tendo confirmado a presença. Essas são as demais comunicações da secretaria, senhor presidente.
Tem uma comunicação ali que eu solicitei ao acadêmico Zé Carlos para fazer, e depois passamos imediatamente ao nosso simpósio.
Excelentíssimo senhor presidente, meus caros confrades que compõem a mesa diretora, prezados amigos, convidados, senhoras e senhores. Para prestar contas de uma quase missão que nós fomos incumbidos de participar em Goiânia na semana próxima passada do 31º encontro dos estudantes de medicina do Brasil. Estiveram presentes, além da minha pessoa, o acadêmico Carlos Eduardo Brandão e o acadêmico Ricardo Cruz. Cada um de nós fez uma conferência de 50 minutos e fomos consideradas pessoas de destaque no encontro dos acadêmicos, organizado há 31 anos pelo nosso honorário nacional Selmo Celênio Porto. Foi algo muito prazeroso e, por conta do patrocínio da academia, a nossa ida lá, os estudantes fizeram promoção da academia. A cada uma de nossas conferências, além dos títulos enunciados por algum membro da comissão organizadora, eles fizeram uma pequena dissertação sobre a Academia Nacional de Medicina, desde a sua fundação, a sua trajetória, os seus objetivos, que foi motivo de muita alegria para nós e foi uma grande propaganda para a academia, que contava lá com cerca de 1.000 estudantes de medicina, principalmente do centro-oeste, parte de Minas e norte do Brasil. Muito bem organizado. E, colateralmente, nós tivemos a oportunidade de ter contato com um oftalmologista, doutor Márcio Ávila, amigo do queridíssimo do Rubem Belfort e do nosso outro oftalmologista, Oswaldo Moura Brasil, e eles nos levou para o que eles chamam de mutirão organizado pela prefeitura, cujo prefeito é Iris Rezende, ex-governador do estado, e nós ficamos impressionados com a quantidade de pessoas que eles atendiam num local bem distante do centro de Goiânia, população pobre e de classe média, e o serviço de oftalmologia prestando integralmente assistência a milhares e milhares de pessoas num único dia. Algo de uma organização fantástica que nos surpreendeu. Nós fomos com um jaleco branco, próprio para a ocasião, que o oftalmologista nos cedeu. Fizemos uma série de fotografias lá no meio do povo, no meio do mutirão, e também tivemos um jantar na casa dele, na mansão dele, que é do conhecimento do nosso Rubem Belfort, de forma que foi uma verdadeira apoteose, e eu saí de lá muito gratificado e acho que valeu muito a pena a academia ter feito este pequeno investimento nessa nossa ida. Muito obrigado, senhor presidente. Em nome dos 3 acadêmicos, agradeço a sua cooperação e patrocínio na nossa ida. Obrigado.
Muito obrigado, acadêmico Zé Carlos. Eu pedi exatamente que ele repetisse aqui o que nos falou na reunião de diretoria, da importância de haver esses eventos com os jovens, aí no sentido de nós sairmos daqui e irmos aonde eles estão. E foi por isso que eu apoiei inteiramente essa iniciativa que me foi trazida pelo acadêmico Zé Carlos. Parabéns aos que foram lá e ao Zé Carlos pela iniciativa. Vamos passar agora para a sessão Fronteiras de Inovação em Medicina Transnacional, Imunoterapia no Câncer. E nós vamos ter como primeiro speaker o Dr. Samir Farah, que vai nos falar sobre Developing Viral Immunotherapies in Cancer Treatment. O professor Farah, ele é PhD em Engenharia Bioquímica da Universidade de Stanford, é engenheiro bioquímico do MIT, do Institute of Technology of Massachusetts, também MBA pela Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Samir Farah tem uma ampla experiência em vacinas, quase 20 anos de experiência científica e também comercial, executiva na área de biotecnologia. Com a palavra, Dr. Samir.
Thank you. Thank you for the very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I really like to thank Dr. Costi Silva, President of the Academy, and the other members of the Academy for having me here today. Last time I was in Brazil was a long time ago. It was 17 years. It was 2002. And I was a much younger man then, but I left with really wonderful, beautiful memories of the country, the natural beauty, the warmth of the people. And it's been my desire to come back ever since. And this is the first opportunity I've had to do so. And it makes it even more special to do it with an opportunity to engage the scientific community. So thank you again for having me. Today, I'd like to tell you about Turnstone Biologics, but really focus in on the technologies and the medicines, the new medicines we're developing for cancer immunotherapy. Let me just start telling you a little bit about the company itself. Turnstone is headquartered in New York City, as well as Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Our scientific founders are from Canada, and thus that is why we still have a presence there. The company has grown tremendously in the 4 years since we formed it. It is now about 78 people, and we are developing multiple viral immunotherapy platforms that I'll tell you about today. In terms of fueling the company, we've done I think a very strong job of providing the corporate support that's needed for a company such as this. We've raised over $90 million in terms of investment to fuel the company. And we've also brought in over $100 million in partnership money with collaborations with the pharmaceutical industry. So we've really been able to provide the muscle needed to, again, fuel these developing of these types of technologies. Before I get to the technologies themselves, let me just say a word about the team around this. The company is very much built on the shoulders of our great scientific founders. Our lead scientific founder is a gentleman by the name of Dr. John Bell. Him and his colleagues, Brian Lichty and David Stoidel, have been working together for more than 20 years, and they're really true world leaders in this field of oncolytic viruses. And around them, around the core technologies that they've been able to build in academia, we've been able to support that now with this team of 78 people that really represent some of the best in the industry in terms of developing new immunotherapies. So the technologies that we're developing are shown here, and we like to think of them as viral immunotherapies. Now, as a team, the way we think about viruses are that they are actually very unique in their ability to fight cancer. What makes viruses so special and so unique in the fight against cancer is if you think about the cancer immunotherapy cycle. Viruses offer an opportunity to provide therapeutic intervention at multiple points along the cancer immunotherapy cycle. Viruses can be used for direct oncolysis of cancer cells. They can be used to prime the immune system. They can be used to boost the immune system. They can be used to change the nature of the tumor microenvironment. And they can be used to deliver other therapeutics that can do all of these things as well. I think as a team, the way we think about viruses is that we want to take advantage of this uniqueness that they have to do all these things and provide these multiple points of intervention. Cancer is a complex disease and it needs complex solutions, and viruses seem to be a very good option in that difficult fight. So the two technologies that we're developing are shown up here, two platforms, two different viruses. One we refer to as SKV vaccinia, and the second one is MG1 Maraba. And I'll be talking about both of these today. But let me start just by saying a couple words about them. SKV vaccinia is a large DNA virus. And what we've done with this virus is we've very, very heavily engineered it to have certain properties that I'll talk about momentarily. This virus serves as a very strong and powerful oncolytic virus. But on top of that, what makes it very special is that we can use this vaccinia virus to deliver other therapeutics to the site of the tumor. We can encode other therapeutics in the backbone of the virus, and then when the virus finds its way to the tumor, these other therapeutics can be expressed at the site of the tumor, making it a very powerful type of therapy. MG1 Maraba is very different. It is a single-stranded RNA virus, as opposed to this large DNA virus, which vaccinia is. And again, it represents a very powerful oncolytic virus that we've heavily engineered. But what makes this virus very special is its ability to directly engage the immune system. We can use it as a viral vector, as a cancer vaccine, to deliver antigens to the immune system and mount a very strong immune response against whatever antigens we encode in the virus. So in this case, the Maraba virus acts as both an oncolytic virus as well as a cancer vaccine. And as I said, I'll speak much more of these as we go through the talk today. But here's a quick snapshot of the medicines that we're delivering, the lead candidates. We, of course, have much more behind this. I think the key takeaway here is that for both platforms, the vaccinia as well as the Maraba, our lead program, our lead medicine under each technology should be in the clinic by the middle of next year. So let's start with vaccinia virus. What we're doing, trying to do with the vaccinia virus, I started to allude to it already. First, we're heavily engineering this vaccinia virus to have certain characteristics that we think are important for an oncolytic virus. And I'll talk about more of these in a second. Once we're able to engineer this virus with these capabilities, we can then start encoding these other therapeutics in the virus. And I'll talk more about what these other therapeutics that can be encoded in the virus are. And then lastly, once we've been able to build all this up, we can start selecting our lead candidates. And we have selected our lead candidate that we refer to as TBio 6517. And I'll talk about that as well momentarily. But let's start out with a question of why vaccinia? Why does vaccinia serve as a good virus for a viral immunotherapy approach? One of the great things about vaccinia is the extensive human experience that we've had with this virus. If you look at the smallpox vaccine, millions of children have been vaccinated with the vaccinia virus. We've also, with other oncolytic viruses that have been based upon vaccinia, have over 500 patients worth of clinical experience. So we know the safety profile of this virus is a good one. We can use it safely. We also know that it can broadly target tumor cells, and that's, of course, very important for our purposes. The problem is that when vaccinia has been tried to be used as a therapeutic previously, it's been missing some key elements. It hasn't been potent enough. The virus has been over-attenuated through multiple passages over cell lines over many years, so it hasn't been strong enough. Secondly, its lack of selectivity. It will seek out and find cancer cells, but it will also hit normal cells, and that's something we want to avoid. And lastly, because it's this large DNA virus, it interacts with its host in a certain way where it's actually immunosuppressive. It tries to dampen the immune system around it for its own survival. And that's a problem for us because we want whatever virus we're using to be immune stimulatory. We're trying to engage the immune system and not suppress it. So we went on this engineering effort to build a vaccinia that would overcome all these problems of the past. And we started with the most potent strain we could find, which was a Copenhagen strain of the virus. And we started interrogating the backbone. And through this interrogation, we were able to remove 25 kb of genetic material from the virus. And this 25 kb represented the host interactions that the virus had, this immunosuppressive effect that the virus had with its environment. So by removing these sets of genes, we were able to turn this from an immunosuppressive virus into one that was immune stimulatory. That was a very important step. But the other things that we were able to accomplish with this engineering effort is that we were able to maintain the virus's potency, and we were also able to increase its selectivity for cancer cells beyond normal cells. And this will become very important for us, and I'll explain why in just a moment. So we were able to give all these characteristics to this newly engineered vaccinia virus. The other thing we were able to do was create more genomic space within the genome of the virus. And this allows us to plug in other things to the genome. And this is where we can use that genetic space to put in other therapies. We can put in a PD-1 antibody. We can put in a CTLA-4 antibody, an IL-2, an IL-15. The opportunities are endless, and we can do multiple of these at a time. So that actually the virus is delivering these therapeutics and becomes this factory for them within the body. So in this way, this becomes a very, very powerful therapy. We looked, of course, at this virus without putting anything else in it first, just to see how it behaved. And what we saw, we liked very much. We saw that the virus maintained potency, just like the parental strain it came from. We also saw that it was safer than the parental strain. In mouse studies, the mice didn't drop weight like they normally do when you put large amounts of other types of viruses in them. We also focused on this idea of selectivity. Would the virus hone in on cancer cells, or would it also go to normal cells? And the two panels on the right show other versions of vaccinia virus and what happens with them. As you can see, when the virus is delivered, it distributes throughout the body. It goes to the snout and the paws and the tails, as well as the tumor, which is implanted in the flank here. If you look at the turnstone virus on the left-hand panel, you can see how the virus only hones in on tumor cells. And this is so important for us because, again, the way we want to use this is we want to deliver other therapeutics. And you can imagine that these other therapies that we're going to use this virus to deliver have some toxicity associated with them. And if we're putting in 3 or 4 of these at a time, We only want them expressed in the tumor microenvironment. We don't want them distributed throughout the body. And that's why the selectivity became such a critical factor in our development. So once we were able to accomplish all this, we then had the opportunity to start figuring out how to use this virus. It's a very powerful oncolytic, but now we can start plugging things into it. And as I said, the options are really limitless. We can put in immunomodulators like the PD-1s and the IL-2s of the world. We can put in dual-specific antibodies. We can put in T-cell engagers. We can really put in whatever we want. And so we had to figure out for our first medicine, for our first product, what combination of things were we going to plug into this vaccinia virus. And that's shown here. Our lead medicine from this platform is we refer to as TBio-6517. And we chose to put in 3 different immunomodulators: a FLT3 ligand, CTLA-4 antibody, and an IL-12, membrane-bound IL-12. And these were chosen after months and months of deliberation for a very specific reason. What we're trying to do with this technology is really drive biology in a desirable way. And in this case, we're trying to create or drive biology such that we can create an environment around the tumor that will make it much more immune friendly. And by using these 3 combinations of immunomodulators, we think we'll be able to suppress T regulatory cells, kind of get them out of the way, activate APCs and other dendritic cells, and also drive tumor-specific T cells, again, with this combination of therapies being delivered with this vaccinia virus. So we're extremely excited about this program. We've taken it through its preclinical workup. Just going to show you a couple snapshots of the data. This data shows, in a difficult tumor model that's been seeded for 14 days before we begin treatment, we can achieve tumor control or tumor eradication with this technology versus control. And another example of some of the data that we've been generating is, comparing this version, this TBio-6517 versus the virus itself, versus ipilimumab by itself, versus combinations thereof. And what we see is the virus is very potent in terms of tumor control and tumor eradication, especially when done in combination with things like other checkpoint inhibitors. So we have every reason to be excited as we move towards the clinic with this technology and this product in particular. And we're on a path right now to getting this into a phase 1 study. The plan is to file an IND to get into the clinical studies in January. And we anticipate being in the clinic certainly within the first half of next year. When we go into the clinic, we'll be targeting difficult to treat cancers, things like MSS colorectal cancer, triple-negative breast cancer, mesothelioma, renal cancer, cervical cancer. We're really trying to select cancers that have either proven refractory or you get a lot of relapse patients from the traditional checkpoint inhibitors like Pembro. And so we're putting the bar high for ourselves. We're going to go in combination with PD-1 and by ourselves. So the product alone as well as in combination. And we're going to look at it both with intravenous delivery as well as direct tumor injection delivery. The goal is to really find the setting where this technology can make a significant difference for patients. So that's the story with vaccinia and TBio-6517. So for the last part of my talk, I want to talk a little bit about the other platform, MG1 Miraba. Now, before I tell you about the virus itself, which has an interesting story tied to it, I want to describe how we use this virus because it's very different from what we do with vaccinia. I mentioned before, it has a dual mechanism of action. It works as a very potent oncolytic, but it can also act as a T-cell vaccine to generate a strong immune response against target cancer antigens. So what we do is the following. We inject the virus into the bloodstream, and the virus likes to traffic to 2 spots in the body. It will go to tumor cells quite directly, but it also likes to traffic to the spleen. And this ends up being very important. In the spleen, this is where the virus acts like a cancer vaccine, like a T-cell vaccine. As I mentioned, we encode cancer antigens within the virus. Once the virus gets to the spleen, the antigens are expressed and presented to the immune system there. In the spleen, you have dendritic cells, central memory T cells. You have all the ingredients to generate a strong immune response. And indeed, that's what happens. We generate an enormous T cell response to the antigens that we're targeting in the spleen. So we get this army of T cells that form against whatever antigens we've encoded into the virus. At the same time that this T cell response is being generated at the spleen, particles of the virus have also trafficked to the tumor. And here, the virus is acting at the site of the tumor much more like a traditional oncolytic oncolytic virus. It's doing all the things a traditional oncolytic virus does. Now, out of all these things, what we think is probably the most important is that you're creating a site of pro-inflammation at the site of the tumor. As we know, tumors are traditionally very immunosuppressive. And by the virus's presence there, you're actually creating inflammation. You're turning that into much more immune active and immune friendly environment. And that becomes very critical because what this technology is supposed to do is on one hand create T cells, but on the other hand create an environment at the site of the tumor that is T cell friendly, that is immune friendly, that will welcome the T cells in and allow them to act and kill the cancer cells. So it's this 1-2, this dual mechanism of action of create the T cells and then create an environment for them to be successful. So the Maraba virus itself, as I mentioned, has an interesting story behind it. Our scientific founders have been doing this for 20 years, and they went out to go find a virus that would have all the characteristics that they wanted. And they brought in collections of viruses from all over the world, over 200 viruses in total, and set up very specific screens to identify the virus that had the appropriate characteristics. And out of this screen of 200 plus viruses rose this little virus, this little RNA single-stranded virus called Maraba, that turns out comes from Maraba here in Brazil, from the Para region. And it's found in Brazilian sandflies. And so it is to us, a previously very obscure virus, but had all these really important characteristics that we were looking for. So in a very unbiased way, we selected it and moved forward with it. We engineered it to further enhance its qualities. And in the end is what we came out with, what we call MG1 Maraba, which is the engineered version. It has these great characteristics, no pre-existing immunity in humans. It is highly selective and targeted and potent in killing cancer cells. It has coding capacity, not as much as the vaccinia virus, which had 50 to 75 kb. In this case, we only have 4 to 5 to work with, but that's okay because we're encoding cancer antigens, and that's enough room to encode our cancer antigens. And it has these other characteristics that we like. So the virus itself, a schematic is shown on the bottom right there. It's just 5 genes long, and we found an insertion site where we can plug in cancer antigens. So we looked at this virus. We looked at it alone by itself first. Is it really a potent oncolytic? And the answer was yes. We looked at it in syngeneic models and in xenograft models, and the data came back very strong. And then we started looking at it in terms of a vaccine. Does it generate this large immune response if we encode antigens in it? And the answer, again, was an overwhelming yes, and that data is shown on the left-hand panel here. Now, at this point, I want to mention something important, and I'll come back to it later. When we use Maraba to generate an immune response, we do it with a prime boost. And so what we do is we put in a priming vaccination first. This can be peptide, it can be RNA, it can be another virus, but it encodes the same antigens. So this is known as a heterologous prime boost, where you present the same set of antigens to the immune system using 2 different vehicles. And so first, we prime the immune system to these antigens, and then we come in with Maraba encoding the same antigens, and that causes the immune response to, in magnitude to increase dramatically. And as I said, this becomes important, and I'll come back to it momentarily. But back to the technology itself, not only did it work well as an oncolytic, as a vaccine, when we put it in combination with a checkpoint inhibitor, it worked even better, not surprising, but there's good rationale behind this. This is a very difficult metastatic lung tumor model. The lungs before treatment are shown on the upper right here, where they're basically sacs of tumors. After treatment, we're able to eradicate this. With our technology alone, we get about 40% long-term survival. When we combine it with pembrolizumab, or an anti-PD-1, we get almost 100% survival. This makes a lot of sense because if you remember, we're creating the T cells, we're getting them to the tumor, but it still stands to reason that by using a checkpoint inhibitor to lift the brakes off those T cells, that we can increase their activity. So we were very pleased to see this synergistic behavior between the two. So with all this data in hand, we went into the clinic. So we've been into the clinic with MG1 Miraba. Now, we had two medicines that we took into the clinic. The first was Miraba, MG1, encoding a single cancer antigen called MAGE-A3. And this cancer antigen is overexpressed on multiple kinds of cancer, including non-small cell lung cancer and others as well. And then the second medicine was MG1 Miraba, encoding HPV antigens. And the idea was to go after HPV positive cancers, such as cervical cancer and head and neck cancer and others. We went into multiple phase 1 trials with these two products. We saw a great safety profile. We were able to dose these viruses at high levels, which was very important. We saw some adverse events, but they were flu-like symptoms, exactly as you would expect from cytokine release that happens when you put viruses into the body. They tended to be acute and transient, so it was a nice safety profile there. There was some laboratory toxicities, but again, these were all mild and moderate. We could manage them very well. In terms of the data that was generated, this was promising also. Now, the patients that we took this product into were a very difficult set of patients. These were last-line cancer patients. They were bucket trials, so we looked at patients from almost every kind of solid tumor. Most of them had experienced 2 or 3 or 4 lines of therapy previous to this. So very, very difficult patient population. And for that reason, in the phase 1 studies, we were really looking for the biomarker data, the correlate data, the biologic data. And specifically, we were looking for 3 things. Were we getting changes in the tumor microenvironment? Were we getting T cells to be generated against the cancer antigens? And then were these T cells trafficking into the tumor? And then, although it wasn't a primary goal of the study, and as I said, we're in a very difficult patient population, we of course looked at efficacy as well. We wanted to see, were patients receiving any sort of objective response or benefit? Let me talk first about the correlate data, the biomarker data. Coming out of phase 1, we saw great proof of mechanism. We saw everything we wanted to see. We saw changes in the tumor microenvironment. There was an upregulation of all the immune markers we were looking at, things like chemokines and APC markers and innate immunity markers. All of these were increasing. We knew we were affecting the tumor microenvironment. We also were able to generate a very strong immune response. In most of these patients, we were seeing after treatment between 1% to 2% of all of their T cells were now targeted against the antigen that we were targeting. And this is a really impressive number if you put it in the context of other cancer vaccine technologies. And then lastly, although we didn't see this as maybe as consistently as we would like, we also saw evidence that not only were we making these T cells, but they would get to the tumor. And that's shown on the left-hand panel here, where in a single patient before treatment, nothing completely, no immune activity. After treatment on the bottom, we would see infiltration of CD8 T cells and upregulation of PD-1. So we're getting that activity happening at the site of the tumor. We even started to see signs of some clinical benefit, not throughout the whole patient population, but there were signs of it. And this is an example of one patient that had a partial response to our treatment. It was an oropharyngeal, a patient with oropharyngeal cancer. This patient had received 4 lines of previous therapy, including pembrolizumab, PD-1 checkpoint inhibitor. It had failed that treatment. What we did is we combined our therapy with a checkpoint inhibitor. In this case, it was atezolizumab, and the patient benefited. The patient had a partial response. So this was very encouraging data. So at this point, we looked at the data, and we said, we're still in the middle of phase 1, and we said, okay, it looks like if you combine what we're seeing in terms of biomarkers and initial signs of some partial responses, it looks like we have something that's biologically active, that something has a real chance to benefit cancer patients. But we had this feeling that it wasn't enough. We felt that we had to somehow strengthen the therapy beyond the benefit that it was providing. And so we had a very difficult question on our hands. Do we continue to dose patients in the phase 1 study with this data in hand, or do we somehow try and find that way to strengthen what we're doing and then come back into a phase 1 study? Very difficult decision, but I'm proud to say our team chose the latter and said, you know what, let's pause these trials and let's find a way to strengthen this therapy to a point where we really believe that it can change a cancer patient's lives. And so what we had to do is figure out, what is the hurdle we're trying to achieve? What's the bar? What is it that we think with this therapy we can do that will change cancer patients' lives? And we looked at what our therapy was doing. We were happy with the modulation of the tumor and microenvironment that we were seeing, but we questioned the level of immune response. Was it enough? And we came to the conclusion that many do, that the T-cell response you generate has to be of sufficient magnitude, but it also has to be sufficient duration, has to be sufficient breadth, has to be sufficient quality. And so we looked to other cancer vaccine technologies, and we didn't see that any of them were generating the needed T-cell response. We didn't find our answer there in terms of what the bar was that we should be trying to achieve. Where we found it is we looked to the cell therapy field. And technologies like CAR T-cells and others have not been very successful with solid tumors. But nevertheless, we sifted through the data, and specifically TIL therapy, we started to see something that we could point to. And with TIL therapy, in situations where you're able to achieve over 10% of a patient's T-cells against a target antigen and sustain that level of T-cell response for 3 or 6 or 9 months, you start to correlate that with consistent patient benefit. So we decided that that should be the bar. We need that level of immune response for that duration in the context of providing changes to the tumor microenvironment, and we need to do so better than cell therapy. We need to remove the complexity, the costs, the manufacturing, the toxicity. You know, with cell therapy, you have either lymphodepletion or IL-2 conditioning. All these things are very, very toxic. So we think we can do all this better with our technology. So that's what we've set out to do now. Now, I want to describe to you just very briefly in the last part here, what is the way that we're going to use Miraba now that can generate this new level of immune response? And it's an approach that we refer to as super boost. Now, I described earlier the way we used Miraba. We primed the immune system, and then we came in with Miraba to boost the immune response. In a super boost setting, we do the exact same thing, but we actually add a third agent to come in and present the antigens one more time. Sounds very simple in concept. Instead of presenting the antigens in 2 ways to the immune system, now we're going to do it in 3 ways. And we come in with this last boost that we refer to as super boost. Interestingly enough, nobody else is doing this idea of using 3 viruses to drive an immune response against antigens. And that's what we've started doing. And the data has been incredibly strong. We're seeing at least a doubling of the immune response when we add that second viral booster, that third agent to the mix. And we're seeing the duration sustained. We're seeing 3 months, 6 months, 9-month type of duration, exactly what we want. And this is an example of some of the data we're seeing. And this is a model system using an HPV antigen in mice. And here's another example using CMV antigen in mice. And here, as you can see on the right, the blue line represents the old way of doing it with a prime and a boost. The red line shows exactly the same thing, but after a prime, a boost, and now what we call a super boost. And it's a dramatic difference in terms of magnitude and duration. If you compare these 2 curves, it's 12 times more area under the curve in the red immune response versus the blue one. That presumably means 12 times the exposure of the tumor to T cells. And this is why we're so excited about the potential of this therapy. We think it's what's needed to drive therapeutic benefit. And so now we're restarting these phase 1 studies that we paused. And we're starting with HPV, going after HPV positive cancers by encoding HPV antigens. HPV sets up as such a perfect application of this technology. We know that HPV-associated tumors are very susceptible to attack from our virus, so we should get viral killing. And we also know that HPV antigens, because they're foreign, we can drive very, very large immune responses against them. So that's why we're really focusing on this as the first medicine going back in the clinic. And so here is where we are with our MG1 HPV Super Boost program. We expect to submit an IND to restart those clinical trials in the second quarter of next year, so about 6 months from now, and be in patients shortly thereafter. We're going to go after two different distinct patient populations, anogenital cancers, things like cervical and vaginal and vulvar cancer, as well as head and neck cancer. And again, we're very excited to bring this program back forward, into the clinic. We'll look at it in combination alone with PD-1 as well as alone. And so that's really what I wanted to share with you today, the description of those two technologies, where they are, what we've put behind them, and the medicines that are coming out of them. If I could leave you with just a couple thoughts. One is, viruses really are very unique in their ability to be used as anti-cancer agents. And I think it behooves us to really explore that to the full and add that to the full armamentarium of technologies that are being developed against cancer. The second thing is that, and I think everybody in this room would agree with this, is that it's always important to shoot very, very high. I think it was a lesson learned with our MG1 Miraba program. We could have continued with that study and maybe drove some incremental patient benefit, but that's not why we're here. We're here to make very large changes in therapy and to affect and benefit a multitude of patients in very dramatic ways. So thank you for your time today and for your attention. It's been a pleasure being here to speak with you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sami Farah. I'd like to invite you to sit down here. And you move to the next speak because we have the discussion at the end of the meeting. So, the acadêmico Daniel Tabak vai nos falar sobre o William Color Revisited Cancer Immunotherapy in the Microbiome.
Senhor presidente, senhores acadêmicos, Dr. Farah, boa noite a todos. First of all, I'd like to address our invited speaker in English. First of all, I want to apologize for not giving this talk in English. It would take me too long. And but anyway, the slides are all in English, and be glad to talk to you, and we can have the questions after that. But switching languages. A vinda do Dr. Farah aqui na semana seguinte é extremamente oportuna. Aqueles que tiveram a oportunidade de estar aqui na semana passada viram a possibilidade de, quando nós discutimos sobre o vírus, que para nós no Brasil é o vírus Marabá, nós discutimos sobre a existência do vírus da dependência do município de Carajás, no Pará. E a vinda dele aqui é interessante porque, novamente, para aqueles que não estiveram aqui, Marabá, na língua indígena, quer dizer filho do estrangeiro e do índio. Então, a ideia de reunir aqui canadense, americano e um brasileiro, eu acho que é muito oportuno diante dessa nossa possibilidade de discutir alguns aspectos distintos do microbioma. Então, Paul Gauguin, em 1897, pintou esse quadro. Esse quadro existe na Academia de Artes em Boston, e é um quadro enorme que ele descreve, é muito interessante como ele chamou esse quadro. Gauguin pintou esse quadro 6 meses antes de tentar o suicídio, e, na verdade, o slide pode ser um pouco confuso, o quadro, mas ele é lido por aqui, em que o nascimento se segue ao início da vida e, finalmente, à morte. E, na verdade, eu trago isso somente como uma alusão do que eu pretendo fazer no sentido de transcorrer ao longo dessa discussão sobre o início, a continuidade para onde vamos na utilidade do microbioma e no desenvolvimento de novas terapêuticas no tratamento do câncer. Então, se nós analisarmos o microbioma, isso que vem acontecendo, a gente vê que o número de publicações em relação ao microbioma já supera em muitos as publicações em relação à genômica. Isso se nós analisarmos desde 1985. Mas, na verdade, a história do microbioma é muito anterior a isso. L. Metchnikoff, em 1908, ele ganhou o Prêmio Nobel. Ele, na verdade, já imaginava a importância do microbioma na vida humana. Na verdade, ele escreveu esse livro, O Prolongamento da Vida, quando ele valorizou, naquela primeira suas análises, a importância dos lactobacilos na vida do indivíduo, e aquele que tivesse o interesse de preservar a sua vida deveria ingerir essa quantidade grande desses lactobacilos, como se isso, de alguma forma, fosse uma forma de preservar a sua saúde. Essa história já foi contada diversas vezes aqui, mas, sem dúvida nenhuma, o pai da imunoterapia é William Coley, esse jovem cirurgião que, no início da sua carreira, se confrontou com uma jovem com sarcoma metastático, e o conhecimento desse paciente que sobreviveu no New York Hospital, Mr. Stein, depois de múltiplas infecções numa área ressecada de um sarcoma de pescoço, fez com que Coley buscasse a fonte dessa sobrevivência desse indivíduo, e, de fato, ele conseguiu encontrar diversos pacientes no New York Hospital que haviam sobrevivido ressecções após o desenvolvimento de infecções locais. E ele tomou a iniciativa, a brava iniciativa, de tratar um paciente com inoculações intratumorais de estreptococos. Na verdade, ele conseguiu alguns produtos de um pesquisador conhecido nosso, Dr. Koch, que forneceu algumas culturas de Klebsiella, e ele produziu a chamada Coley's toxin. E ele utilizou isso para tratar muitos pacientes. Na verdade, essa foi a primeira série deles em 1893, foi publicada no American Journal of Medical Sciences, mas, de fato, ele ganhou tal notoriedade que, na verdade, em 1914, a Parks Davis resolveu adquirir a patente dessa toxina de Coley. E o que é mais surpreendente é que existe ainda uma empresa canadense chamada MBVax, que ainda comercializa esse produto. Na verdade, ele está autorizado para administração nas Bahamas, por exemplo, como a toxina de Coley. Talvez seja essa uma forma bem mais econômica, se ela funcionar, de usar a imunoterapia. Mas, de fato, essa relação entre o microbioma e o sistema imunológico é algo muito interessante, porque, como nós vemos, ela pode ser utilizada do ponto de vista positivo, no sentido de promover e desenvolver a nossa imunidade, como nós vimos como o viroma, mas, na verdade, essa relação também pode ser muito prejudicial. A questão fundamental e a importância dele é que existem mais de 100 trilhões de micróbios no organismo, isso representa aproximadamente 3% da massa do ser humano, existem mais ou menos mais de 10 vezes mais micróbios do que células no corpo humano e quase 100 vezes mais genes que no corpo humano. Então, de forma que isso deve ser importante, e a principal localização desses micróbios está exatamente no trato gastrointestinal. E eles podem ser do bem, mas podem ser do mal. Nós sabemos que existem vários micro-organismos responsáveis pela produção do câncer. A maioria deles são vírus. Nós vemos aqui o papilomavírus, a hepatite, o HTLV, associado à leucemia, linfoma do adulto, o HIV, alguns o Epstein-Barr, o Helicobacter pylori. Nós sabemos com a associação do linfoma e de tumores gástricos, mas até há 2 semanas atrás nós não sabíamos da possibilidade de fungos causarem câncer. Na verdade, essa foi a publicação que saiu na Nature há 2 semanas atrás, onde o carcinoma de pâncreas humano foram identificadas partículas de um fungo muito comum no nosso meio, a Malassezia furfur. Na verdade, o fungo da caspa está associada frequentemente no carcinoma de pâncreas. A gente vê Malassezia aqui representado. E o que é interessante nesse modelo da publicação é que a reprodução no modelo animal mostrou exatamente o aumento da expressão da Malassezia. E, de fato, quando esses animais eram tratados com anfotericina, havia uma regressão do carcinoma de pâncreas, e a gente vê que a regressão da fibrose e aumento dos ácidos determinada pela exposição da anfotericina, enquanto que com o veículo, o pâncreas, o tumor não regredia. De fato, então, parece haver exatamente isso que o Dr. Farah mencionou, existe o que os pesquisadores mostraram, é essa proteína MBL, que é uma lectina que se liga a um carboidrato da malacésia. Ela, então, por alguma razão, em alguns indivíduos, acaba determinando um processo inflamatório, ativação do complemento, processo inflamatório e o crescimento tumoral. Então, da mesma maneira como foi demonstrado que o processo inflamatório é capaz de desencadear a resposta imunológica, nós vemos que o processo inflamatório também pode desencadear o tumor. Então, é essa relação que, obviamente, estabelece entre o crescimento do tumor e a imunidade que vão determinar o equilíbrio em que os processos vão se desenvolver. E talvez o melhor modelo para que nós possamos entender essa evolução seja o transplante de medula óssea. E a razão por isso é que o transplante consiste na administração de células imunologicamente competentes de um indivíduo estranho no receptor. E muitas vezes o resultado dessa incompatibilidade é essa complicação aqui em laranja, doença do enxerto contra hospedeiro, ou GVHD, que é o resultado desse desequilíbrio imunológico. O que é curioso é que essa doença do enxerto contra hospedeiro, também tem esses aspectos vários negativos, é o resultado da expressão dessas células T que são sensibilizadas na pele do indivíduo, no colo, promovendo colites e, na verdade, é responsável em 1/3 dos pacientes, desenvolve um quadro agudo e, eventualmente, vem a falecer. O que é curioso, e o grupo de Seattle já havia demonstrado isso há muito tempo, é que aqueles pacientes que não desenvolvem doença do enxerto contra hospedeiro são aqueles pacientes que têm uma maior taxa de retorno da doença, mostrando que esse aspecto imunológico também, de alguma forma, está relacionado com a imunidade do paciente. Da mesma maneira que aqueles pacientes que têm a forma grave, por conta daquelas complicações, são aqueles pacientes que têm uma tendência a sobreviver menos depois do transplante. Então, esse slide talvez vocês não vejam muito bem, mas a representação é clara, existe uma estimulação de vários elementos do sistema imune, e no centro desse processo, as bactérias estão localizadas porque elas podem ter a ativação de processos pró-inflamatórios, mas também uma série de processos de defesa são desencadeadas pelas mesmas bactérias. De novo, esse equilíbrio do sistema imune, no caso agora com a variável determinada pelo microbioma, que é capaz de ativar o sistema imune tanto para o bem quanto para o mal. O resultado essa é a expressão normal da mucosa intestinal, a gente vê ela repleta de muco, várias células imunologicamente competentes favoráveis, e quando essas células são sensibilizadas, o que nós observamos é uma redução da camada de muco, um aumento da expressão de células inflamatórias, TH1, uma diminuição das células supressoras, chamada Tregs, e a gente vê que existe, inclusive, uma variação da concentração bacteriana. Então, essa variação dessa população bacteriana, ela é determinada porque esses pacientes frequentemente utilizam antibióticos. Uma delas é essa bactéria chamada Blaucha, da família dos clostrídeos, é um anaeróbio gram-positivo, e a gente vai falar um pouquinho mais sobre ela. Mas, de qualquer maneira, o que fica claro é que aqueles pacientes que usam antibióticos mais precocemente têm uma sobrevida pior do que aqueles pacientes que não usam antibióticos, e isso se deve ao fato de que aquela diversidade, o número grande de bactérias, quando substituída pelos antibióticos por uma baixa diversidade, eles têm uma má sobrevida. E, de fato, essa publicação mostrou que esse tipo de anaeróbio é fundamental, mostrando que a presença deles estava associada a uma melhor sobrevida, uma menor taxa de doença do enxerto contra hospedeiro, e aqui talvez uma sugestão de que a presença dessa bactéria talvez estivesse associada a uma menor taxa de recidiva. Então, existem, na verdade, muito mais perguntas do que respostas. Quer dizer, quais são esses germes, exatamente o que eles fazem, quais são os seus produtos? Certamente existe uma série de produtos bacterianos que interferem nesse processo. Qual o seu genoma e qual a sua frequência? E, mais uma vez, Demócrito, que esteve aqui na semana passada, volta aqui para nos dizer que tudo aquilo que acontece no universo, de fato, é em parte resultado de chance ou das necessidades. E um exemplo muito claro vem da Segunda Guerra Mundial. Na verdade, a situação para os alemães em 1942 era muito grave no norte da África, porque os alemães estavam sofrendo disenteria e viviam de uma forma muito grave, e eles vinham, de fato, acompanhando lá aqueles beduínos que os orientavam pelo deserto, e perceberam uma coisa muito curiosa. Periodicamente, aqueles beduínos se abaixavam no chão e colhiam do chão aquilo que parecia algumas pedras. Na verdade, não eram pedras, aquilo ali eram fezes endurecidas de camelo. E eles perguntaram, então, para os beduínos, o que vocês fazem com esses produtos? E eles disseram, nós ingerimos. Mas por que vocês ingerem isso? Exatamente para controlar a nossa disenteria. E, de fato, os alemães perceberam que, na verdade, isso não era um fato tão recente. Na verdade, os chineses já haviam entendido isso, que a ingestão de fezes era algo que poderia ser usado para tratar a disenteria. E, na verdade, o que os alemães fizeram, obviamente, eles não ingeriram as fezes, mas eles enviaram as fezes dos camelos para a Alemanha, onde foram isolados bacteróides fragíleis que, de fato, foram ingeridos e resolveram o problema da disenteria. O fato é que, qual a importância disso em relação ao transplante de medula óssea? Bem, vários estudos têm sido feitos com transplante de microbiota em pacientes que têm doença do enxerto contra hospedeiro. Alguns desses estudos vêm sendo conduzidos. É claro que existem várias possibilidades de transplante de fezes do próprio paciente que foram congeladas antes do transplante, possibilidade de usar fezes de terceiros, possibilidade de usar fezes do doador, possibilidades, obviamente, de utilizar fezes por via nasogástrica, possibilidade de usar fezes por via em cápsulas e até por enemas. Outro aspecto muito importante, isso também já foi mencionado aqui em outras situações, é a relação do microbioma com as células T. O Dr. Fará já mencionou isso, mas outro acidente da natureza ensinou um aspecto interessante. Esses são dois camundongos distintos de duas famílias produzidos por dois laboratórios, os camundongos chamados JAX e TAC, dois diferentes camundongos. Esse grupo de pesquisadores no Memorial, na verdade, e no MD Anderson, receberam esses dois camundongos e colocaram eles em coabitação e eles observaram, após a inoculação de tumor, em um deles, o que acontecia. Então, na verdade, o que eles observaram, quando o tumor era inoculado nesse camundongo, na verdade, o camundongo JAX, eles não cresciam. Mas o que eles viram é que quando o camundongo TEC, quando eles vivem juntos, os camundongos têm um hábito meio estranho de ingerir fezes, eles são coprofágicos, e quando os camundongos TEC comiam as fezes JAK, na verdade, os tumores não cresciam. E, de fato, esse fenômeno foi amplificado quando expostos a anticorpos anti-PDL1, e viu-se que a associação do JAK, ou seja, das fezes desse camundongo com anticorpo anti-PDL1, produziu uma resposta antitumoral ainda mais significativa. No ano passado, esses 3 estudos mostraram claramente a interação do microbioma com a sensibilidade a anticorpos anti-PD1, e, essencialmente, a conclusão desses 3 artigos foi o seguinte: o que eles pegaram, os autores fizeram, utilizaram fezes de indivíduos, de pacientes que haviam sido tratados com anticorpos anti-PD1, pegaram essas fezes e alimentaram os camundongos que haviam sido inoculados com tumor. E as fezes daqueles indivíduos que não eram respondedores, na verdade, produziam uma má resposta antitumoral. No entanto, as fezes daqueles indivíduos que responderam aos anticorpos anti-PD1 promoveram uma excelente resposta contra o tumor e levaram ao aumento das células CD8. E a gente vê claramente o que eles documentaram, que essa bactéria, Bifidum bacterium, na verdade, esse é o principal bactéria contida na Activia, né? Então, a Activia é uma produção, é uma cultura bastante simples de Bifidobacterium e que promove esse controle da célula tumoral. De fato, essa publicação, há poucos meses atrás, mostrou o que acontece com pacientes com câncer tratados com inibidores de checkpoint. Aqueles pacientes que recebem antibióticos, na verdade, têm uma resposta muito pior do que naqueles pacientes que não recebem antibióticos. Então, essa é uma questão interessante para o Dr. Fará. Será que aqueles camundongos que cresceram no tumor, será que eles eram construídos em germ-free environment? Nós vamos ter oportunidade de discutir isso depois. Mas existe outro aspecto interessante, eu já havia mencionado essa questão, e nessa semana tão importante em que a irmã Dulce foi santificada, as palavras de Santo Agostinho vêm à tona, de que milagres são fenômenos que não contrariam a natureza. De fato, milagres são fenômenos que contrariam a nossa compreensão da natureza. E esse foi um fato muito interessante, e que tem, obviamente, tudo a ver com a apresentação do Dr. Fará. Em 1975, O Papa João Paulo VI santificou, não a irmã Dulce, mas santificou a Madre Seton, ou Anne Seton, e ela foi declarada a primeira santa americana. E por que ela foi santificada? Ela foi santificada, na verdade, por um evento que aconteceu em 1947. E a história é a seguinte: uma criança que havia sido diagnosticada com LLA, com leucemia linfoblástica aguda, foi apresentada em Hopkins com o diagnóstico da doença. E, obviamente, naquela época, 1947, a única droga era o methotrexate, ela foi encaminhada para Boston, o diagnóstico foi confirmado na ocasião no MGH, e ela foi tratada com methotrexate, teve uma resposta transitória, mas, no entanto, voltou para a sua casa, que era, na verdade, uma pequena vizinhança perto de Hopkins, e apresentou uma progressão da doença. Não só ela apresentou a progressão da doença, mas ela foi internada coberta de feridas, na ocasião, feridas. E os pesquisadores em Hopkins, vendo aquela situação terminal, recomendaram que a família levasse ela de volta para casa. E a família levou para uma casa da santidade, das irmãs de caridade, próxima daquela região, e lá as freiras, muito carinhosas e cuidadosas, perceberam a situação da criança e realizaram que, naquele momento, somente um milagre. Então, elas se lembraram que, muitos anos atrás, uma irmã do convento, irmã Seton, havia realizado um milagre. Um pedaço do tecido que ela havia coberto um paciente, uma jovem que tinha um sarcoma, foi utilizado e ele se curou. Então, por que não fazer essa mesma tentativa? E aquela criança, então, cheia de feridas e células leucêmicas circulando, foi coberta com o cobertor da irmã Seton e ela se curou. Isso é milagre? Bem, na verdade, milagres são aqueles aspectos que a natureza nós não conseguimos entender. E, de fato, essa foi uma publicação no Lancet em 1971. Um paciente com doença com linfoma de Burkitt, aqui a gente vê com uma lesão orbitária, que desenvolveu uma infecção por sarampo e, progressivamente, ele apresentou, antes mesmo do tratamento quimioterápico, uma resolução do quadro da infiltração óssea. De fato, confirmando os aspectos que o Dr. Farah mencionou, do aspecto potente da viroterapia, dos vírus, promovendo remissões de doenças malignas. E esses são os aspectos que o Dr. Farah mencionou. O vírus é incorporado, leva, inclusive, à expressão de vários marcadores na superfície da célula tumoral, ativa o sistema imunológico e, dessa maneira, as células tumorais são destruídas. A primeira vez que eu fui apresentado a essa estratégia, eu achei realmente esse aspecto muito interessante. Em 2014, na reunião da ASCO, o primeiro produto, um vírus herpes modificado, foi utilizado para tratar pacientes com melanoma. De fato, naquela ocasião, esse vírus herpes modificado era usado somente por injeção intratumoral, mas, como foi mencionado, uma vez introduzido dentro do tumor cutâneo, a estimulação do sistema imune acaba promovendo respostas à distância, mostrando a potência dessa estratégia. Imagina quando nós podemos imaginar quando a medicação venosa for utilizada. E, de fato, esse vírus herpes modificado foi aprovado pelo FDA e também pela EMEA, e Imligi, que é o primeiro vírus aprovado para tratamento de melanoma e está aprovado pelo FDA. Isso aconteceu em 2015. Mas existem outras histórias interessantes. Na verdade, o 60 Minutes apresentou a história dessa moça que tinha um glioblastoma, e ela aparece dando essa entrevista com essa infusão aqui intraventricular. Na verdade, o que foi feito foi que os pesquisadores de Duke, usando o mesmo princípio, introduziram um vírus da polio modificado intraventricular. Eles, na ocasião, tinham 2 pacientes, isso foi um resumo apresentado na ASCO, mas no ano passado, no New England, esse estudo foi promovido com um número maior de pacientes. Esses eram pacientes com glioblastoma, todos eles com doença bastante refratária, e que apresentaram resposta. A gente vê aqui pacientes com mais de 72 meses de acompanhamento sem sinais de progressão. Para onde vamos? Então, já há muitos anos, na verdade, nós falamos agora sobre imunidade adquirida, mas um aspecto da nossa imunidade não é mencionado, a nossa imunidade inata, o papel do macrófago. Na verdade, o Dr. Mantovani publicou isso aqui no Lancet em 2001, e há dois meses atrás eu tive a oportunidade, na reunião da em Lugano, da reunião anual de linfomas, ouvi o Dr. Montovani falar sobre os macrófagos. Na verdade, os tumores têm uma estratégia muito interessante para neutralizar a ação dos macrófagos. Na verdade, existe essa relação e essa ligação entre CD47, uma molécula que é expressa na superfície do tumor e que, na verdade, inibe, quando presente, os tumores apresentam isso de uma forma muito intensa, inibem essa relação e a capacidade do macrófago de destruir a célula tumoral. É interessante, e a gente pode imaginar a sua utilidade no tratamento de linfomas, porque CEMIC é capaz de aumentar a expressão de CD47. A gente sabe que os linfomas difusos apresentam essa expressão. Bem, dessa maneira, em novembro do ano passado, o grupo de pesquisadores em Stanford desenvolveu a possibilidade de bloquear aquela relação CD47 com um anticorpo específico. E dessa maneira, com o uso desse anticorpo, isso também foi publicado no New England, o que se observa é que pacientes com linfoma difuso, tratados com CD47, o anticorpo CD47, a gente vê essa resposta num paciente com linfoma difuso de grandes células. Mas o ideal, na verdade, seria se nós tivéssemos esse modelo que o Dr. Farah descreveu, a possibilidade de um robô que pudesse levar a carga específica para dentro da célula tumoral. Então, por que não utilizar uma bactéria? Na verdade, a bactéria tem grandes dessas propriedades, porque ela tem um tropismo exatamente por essas áreas longe da vasculatura, e ela tende a se concentrar nesse tecido que é hipóxico, habitualmente dentro do tumor. E dessa maneira, por que não acoplar em uma bactéria esse anti-CD47, de forma que ele pudesse se comportar como se fosse um cavalo de Troia, a possibilidade de levar exatamente aquela carga para dentro do seio tumoral. E, de fato, essa publicação na Nature Medicine foi muito interessante, porque essa bactéria, um derivado de Escherichia coli, foi construída exatamente em que ela na verdade, um bacteriofago foi inserido dentro do DNA, junto com essa molécula do CD47, e a razão do vírus inserido dentro da bactéria é para que ela pudesse ser destruída de uma forma maciça, e dessa maneira liberasse dentro do seio tumoral aquela carga envenenada, vamos dizer assim. Então, aqui demonstrando exatamente como que ocorre no momento em que aquela carga é destruída, enquanto que quando o modelo não infectado, na verdade, a gente vê a proliferação bacteriana e ela não é destruída como em cima. E essa foi a experiência que foi publicada. A gente vê que com a inoculação do tumor, não consigo ver muito bem aqui, a gente vê, de qualquer maneira, que o volume tumoral é bem menor, em vermelho representado a carga tumoral. A gente vê que existe uma sobrevida maior naqueles camundongos que receberam o cavalo de Troia. Isso quando ele era injetado somente no tumor, mas da mesma maneira como existe a potencialização do sistema imune, uma vez injetado em um tumor, a gente vê a regressão do tumor contralateral. De forma que essa ideia da sensibilização do sistema imune, sem dúvida nenhuma, é muito inteligente. E esse é só visualmente, a gente vê o que acontece progressivamente com salina e com a carga do cavalo de Troia, um tumor. Esse é um modelo de linfoma. Na verdade, ele também vem sendo utilizado para tratar câncer de mama. A20 é um modelo de linfoma em camundongos. De forma que o futuro é brilhante. Hoje, essa é uma publicação do ano passado, a gente vê que existem mais de 2.000, isso no ano passado, é difícil imaginar quantos agentes que nós teríamos hoje para desenvolver, desde, enfim, vacinas, vírus oncolíticos, terapias celulares, anticorpos biespecíficos, os BiTEs, de forma que nós temos uma possibilidade enorme de poder atuar no tratamento dessas doenças, mas nós não podemos esquecer, como foi mencionado hoje à tarde, que nós precisamos lembrar dos nossos modelos, nós precisamos lembrar dos nossos exemplos, lembrar de pesquisadores que, com muito menos recursos que nós tivemos no passado, foram capazes de permitir essa trajetória que, em mais de 110 anos, nos permite antever um futuro bastante promissor no tratamento do câncer, quando nós utilizamos os nossos recursos do sistema imunológico e, sem dúvida nenhuma, sem negligenciar aqueles que são os maiores elementos no nosso corpo. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, acadêmico Tabac. Excelente apresentação. Convido a passar aqui ao nosso lado E lhe convido também a coordenar os debates, porque em presença de autoridade como o acadêmico Tabaque, não há de ser um psiquiatra que vai coordenar a imunoterapia no câncer. Bom, a palavra está aberta aos acadêmicos, quiserem fazer uso. Nós temos alguns oncologistas aqui presentes, estou vendo 2, pelo menos. Que vai fazer uma introdução ao debate.
Thank you very much for being here. I think this issue about the viruses is very interesting, and I got a couple of questions, and just want to introduce. First of all, the differences between the two viruses. You said that they believe as vaccines. Yeah. And they stimulate the T cells. I was interested because T cells are, as a general, you mentioned CD8 cells. What about Tregs? What about the issue about controlling this reaction? Did you follow the evolution of suppressor T cells in terms of and the tumoral niche?
Yeah, thank you. The answer is yes. I think what's interesting about viruses and their ability to stimulate the immune response is where that immune response is being generated. So very often, I think people try and generate immune responses at the site of the tumor, which I think will indeed, you see different types of T cell proliferations. You see, how do you control Tregs, all those issues that you mentioned. I think one of the unique things about Miraba is that we're really generating the T cells in the periphery, that we're using the splenic mechanism where, you have this splenic compartment where you have dendritic cells and you have central memory T cells present. And as long as those central memory T cells, whatever they're precursors to, tend to be what gets boosted by this virus. So if you have a strong pre-existing population of CD4s, that's what you're going to boost. If you have a strong pre-existing population of CD8s, that's what you're going to boost. And that's why the priming vaccination becomes so important, to get that priming vaccination right, establish the right initial population of T cells, and then the Miraba becomes very effective in boosting that through the splenic mechanism.
And also, were you able to follow the expression of PD-L1? Because today there's this big issue about expression and manifestation of the immunotherapy. And as we know, I mean, this is such a mix of cells that express the tumor, the T cells. Is there something important that we should look into when you study your results?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, as I mentioned, these therapies tend to work very well alongside checkpoint inhibitors. This idea, especially with Miraba, that you can create T cells, bring them into the tumor microenvironment, but then by adding in a checkpoint inhibitor, you still give benefit by lifting the brakes off of those T cells. You're right, there's an opposing force here, and that is as you generate that immune response, as you heat up the tumor microenvironment, you're also increasing expression of PD-1, right? So you do absolutely have these competing forces that you need to deal with simultaneously. You also have upregulation of interferon, and so these viruses, as effective they are, also create things that work against the therapy that you have to address head on. So yes, it's a real issue, but what we found is that by combining the therapy with checkpoints, you really do add benefit to what both therapies would do individually.
The other thing I thought was interesting on your presentation was this effect. I mean, it wasn't clear to me. Is this like a single dose, or how often do you dose the mice? And the other thing is, if you follow the persistence of the T cells, I mean, how long do they persist after they are exposed to the virus?
Yeah, and this is a key issue. We run into the same problems with our virus as everybody does with other viruses under development, and that is that eventually you're going to have a strong antibody response or T cell response or whatever to these viruses. So there's only so many times that you can dose them. I think our approach has been hit hard, generate as strong as immune response as you possibly can have the oncolytic activity. And at that point, the hope is that you can really turn, so to speak, the keys over the immune system, right? That you've created the positive microenvironment, you created the T cells, and by supplementing with other therapies like, checkpoint inhibitors and others, you've established that positive environment for the attack on the tumors to be successful. So ideally, would we like the ability to dose viruses longer and more sustained? I think the answer is yes. I don't think we know yet how important that is. Now, for instance, with this super boost approach, right, where we're coming in with a priming agent, then Miraba, then another agent, that really is a way to deal with this issue of running into multi-dosing problems with the same virus, because now you're going to do it with a third agent, with a third virus. And when we do that and you're able to dose, maybe 30 days out from your original Miraba dose, that's when you start to see that duration, because you are continuing to stimulate the immune response. And in those situations, yeah, we're seeing, at least in mice so far, 6-9 months plus in terms of durability of response.
Thank you.
You bet.
Question? Good.
Suassuna, acadêmico Suassuna, José Suassuna.
Many thanks for the 2 lectures. They were actually very enlightening for us that are not in the field. Question I'd like to address, Dr. Farah, is whenever you tamper with genetic material, it all comes to Jurassic Park nightmares. So what prevents these viruses from acquiring foreign virus exchange genetic material all the time? So the question is, how do you prevent, for example, the Vaccinia virus, which is well known to have evolved or have been weakened by years of passage, and you just showed that you were able to boost its oncolytic activity by tampering with the gene. So what prevents this virus or other viruses, because it's a common concern for this sort of therapy, what prevents the virus from acquiring genetic materials that may make them offensive to ourselves rather than the tumor?
Yeah. No, it's a very fair question, and to be truthful here, my lead scientific team could probably answer the question in a much more sophisticated way than I could. The truth is that that's something that we worry about, and of course we're asked by regulatory agencies and such, and so we go out of our way extensively to evaluate the stability of the viruses that we work with. And as you know, as you mentioned, there's some viruses that are more stable than others. There's some viruses that acquire these genetic materials, other genetic materials easier than the others. We've been able to prove, at least with the viruses that we're working with so far, that the stability of these viruses is a key component of what makes them special and what we engineer for and what we test for. So it is on our mind. It is something we analyze continuously. And so far, from what we've done, the 2 viruses platforms that we're working with have proved to be incredibly stable, and we haven't seen any additional genetic material, no matter how many passages we've been able to run.
Cadê Marcelo Morales?
Good evening. It was a really very interesting and very important discussion about gene therapy. Actually, I work with gene therapy mainly with AAV and adeno-associated virus and adenoviruses. And I'm not very, I don't know very well about the Miraba, but I know that you use attenuated virus, right? If I'm not wrong, is the Miraba MG1. And how is this virus attenuated, and how easy is to get the particles of these viruses, and how you grow these viruses in cells, or how do you do that?
So MG1, it's not actually very attenuated. There's been 2 genetic changes that have been made to the virus. The first is to make it more susceptible to standard antiviral pathways that we all have in our body, things like the interferon system. So one change is to make it more susceptible to antiviral responses we have in our normal cells. And this is really what confers selectivity of the virus for cancer cells. The virus is not specific for cancer cells because it's hitting a certain receptor that hits on cancer cells and not others. It's in fact taken advantage of the fact that cancer cells have dampened viral response systems, interferon pathways and others. And so one of the genetic changes we make is to make it more susceptible to these antiviral pathways. The other change, the other genetic change, is actually to make it replicate faster, believe it or not. So in cells where it can take hold, cancer cells, malignant cells, it is able to become even more virulent and replicate faster. So that's what helps confer the potency. So those are the two it's a very simple genome, very small genome, as I showed, only 5 genes in total, and it's only 2 point mutations that we do to change a wild type Miraba into an MG1 Miraba, but they're 2 very important changes. Now, I think, was there another part of your question? I'm
Yes.
sorry. Yeah.
And another part of my question
Yeah.
I'm doing right now is how is the ability of the virus to boost the pre-existing tumor-specific CD4 and CD8 T cells?
Yeah.
How is the mechanism?
Yeah, so this goes directly to this splenic, what happens in the splenic compartment. The virus is very interesting. In the spleen there is and we had to unpick this biology. It was very complex biology to understand, but there is a subset of B cells that exist in the spleen that will let the virus infect these B cells and go through one round of expression, and then the virus will die. So it doesn't proliferate. The virus doesn't proliferate in these splenic B cells, but it will have the opportunity to express its gene products. In this case, it's antigens. And because you have dendritic cells in the spleen and hopefully central memory T cells in the spleen that represent the same antigens, okay? And that's why, again, you do the priming vaccination. You get the presentation to the dendritic cells, you get the cross presentation with the T cells. That's what leads to the proliferation of T cells. It's this combination of being able to express its gene products and having the dendritic cells and the central memory T cells nearby. Now, what's really interesting, the reason we believe that we get such a big immune response coming out of the spleen is that as these T cells, these CD8 effector T cells are made, normally they would attack everything around them, including the antigen-presenting cells that were used to create them in the first place, because those express antigen. What the difference here is that as these T cells are made and they traffic out of the spleen, they're actually not allowed back into the spleen by virtue of how the splenic compartment is designed. So you get CD8 T cells being made, they leave the spleen, and they're not allowed back in to dampen the response. And that's why we think the level of T cell response that we're able to generate with this virus is of such a high magnitude because of this uniqueness of what happens in the spleen.
Acadêmico Barcis.
Thank you very much for such exciting lectures. Yeah, my question is following the previous one. It's not clear to me in your model of priming and boosting with the Maraba virus, how do you define the antigen to be recognized? So, well, this is the question. How do you define that those CD8 cytotoxic T cells will recognize one specific tumor antigen or several, but tumor antigens?
Yeah, this is where we use so with Miraba that is 5 genes long, we've identified an insertion point within this virus where we can add genetic material. And we encode the cancer antigen or antigens we want to target within the backbone of the virus, within the genes of the virus. And then when the virus is in the spleen expressing its viral products, it expresses these antigens and presents them to the immune system. So we can control in this way what antigens we target. Now, the question is what antigens should we target?
Yeah, this is the
Right?
question. Yeah.
And that's not an easy question. I think there are, of course, common things like testes antigens, which are upregulated, seem to be upregulated in cancer cells. Things like MAGE-A3 or NY-ESO-1 or some of these other antigens that are present on normal cells but seem to be upregulated in cancer cells. That's one kind of subset of antigens you can target. And we did that with one of our products. We targeted MAGE-A3. Another way you can go is to target viral antigens. As you mentioned, viruses are very commonly associated with different types of cancer. So one of our products is targeting HPV antigens. We target the E6 and E7 proteins from 2 strains of HPV, strains 16 and 18. And therefore, we get pretty good coverage across HPV positive cancers by targeting those. Of course, the other emerging field, the other emerging area of thought in targeting antigens is this whole idea of neoantigens, where you identify antigens that are very specific to a single patient's tumor, right? That have morphed within. They started out as normal proteins and through the tumorigenesis process have become what we refer to as neoantigens. Now they're morphed antigens. They're no longer normal. They're no longer human proteins. They're something else. And this is an interesting area. It goes to personalized medicine because what you have to do is you have to, of course, biopsy these tumors and identify the set of neoantigens that's specific to a patient's tumor. But then you can take those antigens and you could plug them into Miraba, just like we do any other antigens, and drive the T cell response against those antigens. And that's something that we're in the process of doing. I didn't talk about it today, but that's certainly one of the applications that we're developing. So finding the right cancer antigens is one of the most difficult things in the cancer antigen field, and I don't think we have an answer yet.
Daniel.
You mentioned about this access of the virus to the B cells. Do you have any experience with lymphomas or any heme malignancies in terms of the use of the virus?
We haven't yet. It's a great question. We're trying to decide whether to explore that. We think it's a unique population of B cells in the spleen that allow the virus to go through this very unique thing of expressing its gene products once and then being lysed. We don't think it's common to B cells throughout the rest of the body. We have not looked at B cell diseases of any sort at this point.
Aproveitar que está aqui entre nós o professor Glaucio Oliva, nosso ex-presidente do CNPq, e que amanhã deverá presidir a conferência dele numa grande reunião em São Paulo, podia já fazer um treino para amanhã e nos dizer alguma coisa sobre o tema.
Right. Great, both talks. But I'll save some of my questions to Sami for tomorrow. But I really enjoyed Dr. Tabak's lecture. I think it was very enlightening. And I was particularly interested in your description of different reactions to cancer treatment by patients that have been exposed previously to antibiotics. That means that your microbiome is essential for defining a particular outcome of a treatment. So how can you foresee the combination of this knowledge with the actual clinical practice and even the pharmacological development of new products that sometimes have to look carefully into the microbiome, either of the animals or the people that are going to be used in these developments?
So that's very interesting because it has a practical issue. So these patients treated with checkpoint inhibitors very often come to the emergency room with diarrhea. So they come to the emergency room and the first thing they collect the stools and very soon they start on antibiotics. The other thing, even if they're not acutely ill, prescription of antibiotics is very common. And what they showed on the study, if you get antibiotics before 2 weeks after getting the inhibitors, the response is much less. So now we have all the heterogeneity of the tumor, and also we have some of the effects that are man-made that we do when we treat our patients. So we have to. So my orientation actually for the patients actually is that they should not be taking antibiotics without there's no and unless there is a very critical issue. The other thing that's it's also practical and interesting is the fact that because of that, people are starting treating patients with probiotics without even knowing what exactly is the bacteria that has the positive effect and negative effect. In fact, the FDA called in, these fecal microbial transplants being used to treat C. difficile diarrhea. And so just this July, there were 2 cases that were reported by the FDA of patients that developed septicemia after getting the transplant. So the issue about giving probiotics to patients that are immunodeficient is a very critical one. So that's another practical issue about doing just before exactly when knowing. It's very common. Patients come in the office and they've seen the nutritionist, and she's already been given all these drugs that actually have some effect, which can be positive or negative. So the things for the future, I think the model in bone marrow transplantation is a very good one because we can, with this 16S sequencing, with shotgun sequencing with NGS, we can actually define the phyla. We can actually define much more bacteria than just by general culture. And with doing that, we can, for example, select the antibiotics. We can define the issue about giving or not, and according to the population. So I think this is there are many possible issues. I would say that in transplantation, there's interaction with a lot of this bacteria with the immune system, with some genetics from the donor and also from the patient. And I think the understanding of that's going to bring some more issues of how they can control, how they can use immunosuppression in terms of improving their survival. So I think this is a very critical issue that has not been seen significantly because there were not the tools. But now that we have the tools, I think this is something that has to come in the equation.
Maybe Dr. Farah can comment a little bit on the development phase where or not you look into this possible association with the outcome of your assays with respect to the previous exposure of your animals or even the microbiome which is present in your animals.
It's actually, there's so many variables in cancer, as you know, and this is not one that we've tackled yet. Interestingly enough, though, our head of manufacturing of CMC and manufacturing comes from a company that was developing, it's called Cirrus Therapeutics. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but developing fecal transplant material and others for, to treat the microbiome. So it's something that he's always talking to us about. We got to look at this, we got to look at that. It's not something yet, given all the complexities and all the other questions that we have to answer, that we've been able to tackle.
I have a question to you, Daniel. You talk about the microbiome and antibiotics early in the life. There is a difference between the microbiome and the immunity system early in the life and late in the life of the middle age?
There is a great question because in the early days of bone marrow transplantation, initially when mice were created, were raised in germ-free environments, it was clear that the mice that were not grown, after the mice were giving the conventionalized diet, so they're not germ-free anymore, they developed this immunological reaction. So bacteria has something to do with that. And so the idea came that you should also treat patients in these germ-free rooms, the laminar airflow rooms. And in fact, the early studies suggested that patients that were put in these rooms actually had a better survival. But the issue is different because they thought about the babies that didn't have any bacteria. But the problem is that the environment of the baby is actually a very mature one. It's different than on transplantation. And in fact, that's why it's important for the babies to develop their bacteria, because they're going to be stimulating their immune system and maturing that. And therefore, this should not be exactly the model. But maybe this is the issue about the differences in an early model, like bone marrow transplantation, and the situation with the babies that are also germ-free. But yes, this was the idea of the initial investigators when they thought about doing transplants on patients that were germ-free.
Thank you. Any other question? Professor Baczynski.
One question to Dr. Tabak. If you could speculate on which is the mechanism when the mice of different strain cohabit the same cage, how the microbiome gets homogenized? Because depending on the mechanisms, you can or cannot extrapolate it to humans. No?
Well, I think the issue is the same. I mean, when you have the stools of one of the mice, when the Jack's mice have their stools ingested by the TAC mice, the problem is that is in the Jack's stool are the bacteria that are actually immunogenic. In fact, that bifidobacterium was isolated from the stool of the Jack's mice that have this reaction against the tumor. So Jack's mice don't grow the tumor. So the tumor doesn't grow in these mice that have a very active immune system. And the immune system is actually boosted because of their feces where there is the bacteria. So these mice where the tumors don't grow have bacteria in their intestines that stimulate the CD8 cells that attack the tumor. And when the TAC mice ingest the stool from the other mouse, from the Jacks, now they ingest the feces that have the immunogenic bacteria, and the tumor doesn't grow. So the issue is about eating stool. So if you eat the right stool, you're in good shape. I thought about the end of the slide. I was going to show a slide that shows like this. Keep calm, shit happens. But if shit happens, you have to turn it into fertilizer. So the issue is actually transforming shit in a fertilizer. So that's what these mice are doing. They actually boosting their immune system with the right bacteria.
Okay, thank you very much.
No, you'd like to talk? Oh. If there is no more question, if you want to make some final remarks, you, Andre, Daniel, please.
Thank you. No, again, just I am very thankful for the chance to be here, engage with everybody today. I appreciate the great questions that were asked. It's really exciting to feel the excitement about new technology like this. I think hopefully there's a real opportunity in Brazil here to invest and support innovation that will lead to new opportunities like this. And I think it all starts with strong academic environment and what can be built from there around it. So thank you again, and I've really enjoyed my time and look forward to, if there's any other follow-up questions following this discussion, be happy to speak with everyone. Thank you.
Also, I would like to thank Dr. Farah for his presence here. I think this was a very enlightening afternoon We had great talks in the beginning, and I think this was the crowning. I think we had a great discussion. With thanks to all this our academics here that work very much in the research area in immunology. And I think there's certainly great opportunities, and we hope that the investments in the area of development and research keep on coming so we can pursue many of these issues. And certainly we have the proper environment here to have this progress also in this field of immunology. In fact, you may not know, but last week we had this first experience with CAR T cells that were actually manufactured here in Ribeirão Preto. And this was a technology that was developed in the university. There's a Celgene facility. And I think we're all excited with the possibility of developing new technologies here in Brazil. And I think we are very thankful again for your presence here. We enjoyed a very great afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sam Farah. And I continue with you in the dinner and tomorrow in São Paulo. And so you have a dinner for... Nós temos jantar para os speakers de hoje, ali o professor Novelino, o Mário, o Adolfo. Temos aí também você não vai, né? Mas você vai, Marcelo. E esse vai aqui mais tarde. O Daniel está com compromisso aí, não pode ir, mas queria agradecer o apoio de trazer aqui o Sami Farah. Foi muito interessante esse assunto de imunoterapia, um assunto que não é mais do futuro, é de agora. Gostei da ideia do robozinho viral, parece realmente interessante, no sentido de atingir a célula cancerosa, né? E agradecer ao Glaucio aí, sempre apoiando as iniciativas aqui, e vamos continuar conversando um pouco mais aí durante o jantar. Muito obrigado a todos e boa noite.